I was standing outside my son's kitchen door with a box of blueberry muffins when I heard my daughter-in-law discussing my funeral. Not my husband's. Mine. White lilies, Brittany said casually. Annette always liked those. And once the house sells, Ryan and I can finally move somewhere bigger. I froze. I was 68 years old, healthy, still running my flower shop 6 days a week, and had just passed my annual physical with perfect results. Yet Brittany was talking about my funeral as if it were already on the calendar. Then she laughed softly and said something that made my blood run cold. When she's gone, everything will be so much easier. I stood there, unable to breathe, realizing I might not know my daughter-in-law at all. If this story touches you in any way, please take a moment to like and subscribe. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you do if you overheard someone planning your funeral while you were still very much alive? Leave a comment below. And if you'd like, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I'd truly love to know. My name is Annette Schultz. And until the afternoon, I overheard my daughter-in-law discussing my funeral. I believed I had a simple life, not a perfect life, not an easy life, but a good one. I was 68 years old and lived in the same 2-story brick house in Columbus, Ohio, where my husband Michael and I had raised our son. Every room held a memory. Every creak in the floorboards felt familiar. I could walk through that house in complete darkness and know exactly where I was. Michael had been gone for 8 years. Even now, saying those words still hurt. Cancer took him much faster than either of us expected. 1 month, we were making plans for a vacation to Maine. 6 months later, I was standing beside a grave wondering how I was supposed to spend the rest of my life without him. People often assume that grief fades away. It doesn't. You simply learn how to carry it. For a long time after Michael died, I wasn't sure what my future would look like, but I had responsibilities. I owned Schultz Floral, the flower shop Michael and I had built together nearly 30 years earlier. The shop became my lifeline. Every morning, I arrived before sunrise. I arranged bouquets. I met brides planning weddings. I comforted families planning funerals. I watched people celebrate births, anniversaries, graduations, and every milestone in between. Flowers accompanied every chapter of life. Somehow, helping others through their happiest and saddest moments helped me survive my own. At 68, I was still working 6 days a week. I drove myself everywhere. I balanced my own finances. I handled my own repairs. I climbed ladders when I needed to. My doctor often joked that I had more energy than patients 20 years younger. That's why Brittany's conversation shocked me so deeply. I wasn't dying. I wasn't even slowing down. As far as I knew, I still had many good years ahead of me. My son Ryan had always been the center of my world. Michael used to tease me that I worried about Ryan more than any mother should. Maybe he was right. Ryan was 42 now. Successful, kind-hearted, and hard-working. He worked as a regional sales manager for a manufacturing company and had built a comfortable life for himself. I couldn't have been prouder. When Ryan met Brittany 17 years earlier, I welcomed her immediately. At first, she seemed wonderful. She was charming, confident, friendly, the kind of woman who could walk into a room and have everyone laughing within minutes. When Ryan announced their engagement, I cried tears of happiness. I truly believed I was gaining a daughter. For the first several years, that's exactly how it felt. Brittany called me Mom. She brought me homemade casseroles when I caught the flu. She remembered birthdays. She invited me to family dinners. When Sophie was born, Brittany trusted me to babysit almost every week. Some of my favorite memories came from those years. The four of us spent holidays together. Summer barbecues, Christmas mornings, Thanksgiving dinners that lasted for hours. There was warmth in our family. At least, that's how it appeared. Looking back now, I can see that the changes began slowly. So slowly that I barely noticed them. The first questions seemed innocent enough. One afternoon, Brittany asked how long I planned to keep working. I laughed. As long as my legs keep moving. She smiled. That's good. I just worry about you sometimes. At the time, I thought it was sweet. Months later, she asked whether I had considered downsizing. That house is awfully big for one person, she said. I shrugged. I like my house. She nodded but didn't look convinced. Then came questions about finances, and nothing direct at first. Just casual curiosity. How is the flower shop doing? Had property values increased in my neighborhood? Did I still have the life insurance policy Michael purchased years ago? Again, none of those questions seemed especially strange individually. Families talk about finances. At least some families do. But eventually, I noticed a pattern. Brittany seemed unusually interested in my assets. Never my hobbies. Never my travel plans. Never my friends. Always my finances. One Thanksgiving, while everyone was helping clean up dinner, she asked whether I had updated my will recently. I remember laughing awkwardly. That's an unusual holiday conversation. She laughed too. I know. I just think it's important to be prepared. Prepared. That word appeared more frequently over the years. Prepared for emergencies. Prepared for aging. Prepared for the future. Prepared for the inevitable. At the time, I interpreted her comments as concern. Now I wasn't so sure. The more I thought about the conversation I'd overheard outside Ryan's kitchen, the more memories resurfaced. Small moments, forgotten remarks, questions that suddenly felt different. There was the time Brittany asked whether the flower shop building was fully paid off. Another occasion when she asked if Ryan would eventually inherit the business. Once, she even asked whether I had considered selling the property and moving into a retirement community. When I declined, she seemed disappointed, not angry, just disappointed, as though my answer had interfered with some plan she hadn't shared. After overhearing her funeral discussion, those memories replayed in my mind like scenes from a movie. For the first time, I began viewing them through a different lens. And that frightened me, because I wanted to believe I was wrong. I wanted to believe Brittany was still the woman who brought me soup when I was sick, the woman who hugged me after Michael's funeral, the woman who promised she would always take care of our family. But another part of me couldn't ignore what I'd heard. No misunderstanding could explain that conversation. No innocent explanation could justify discussing the sale of my house as though my death were already guaranteed. That evening, I sat alone on my back porch. The sun was setting behind the trees. Michael used to sit beside me there every evening. Sometimes I still imagined hearing his voice. I stared across the yard and tried to make sense of everything. Maybe Brittany was simply insensitive. Maybe she was planning far ahead. Maybe there was some explanation I hadn't considered. But deep inside, a quiet feeling had begun to grow. A feeling I couldn't shake. For the first time in years, I found myself wondering whether someone I trusted had been hiding their true intentions all along. And if that was true, I had a feeling the worst was still ahead of me. Over the next few weeks, I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. After all, one disturbing conversation didn't automatically mean Brittany was plotting against me. People said strange things sometimes. People made insensitive comments. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe there was something I had misunderstood. That was what I kept telling myself. But once doubt enters your mind, it becomes difficult to ignore. Suddenly, I started noticing things I had previously brushed aside. The first incident happened during Sunday dinner at Ryan and Brittany's house. We were sitting around the dining table eating roasted chicken while Sophie talked about an upcoming school theater production. The conversation was pleasant until Brittany casually turned toward me. "So, Annette," she said with a smile, "have you ever thought about updating your estate plan?" I nearly dropped my fork. Ryan barely reacted. Sophie looked confused. I forced a laugh. "That's an unusual dinner topic." Brittany smiled. "I just think it's important to stay organized." "There isn't much to organize." She laughed. "Mom, come on. You own a successful business, a valuable property, and investments. That's not exactly not much." Something about the way she said it made me uncomfortable. Not because it was inaccurate, because it sounded rehearsed, as if she had spent time thinking about it, far more time than I ever had. I changed the subject, but Brittany wasn't finished. A few minutes later, she returned to it. "Have you updated your will recently?" I looked directly at her. "Why do you ask?" She shrugged. "No reason." Then she immediately looked away. The conversation moved on, but a strange silence settled inside me. Later that night, I found myself replaying every word. The next incident happened at my flower shop. Brittany stopped by unexpectedly one Tuesday afternoon. At first, everything seemed normal. She brought coffee, asked about business, complimented a wedding arrangement I was finishing. Then, while looking around the shop, she asked something that caught me off guard. "What happens to the business if you retire?" I looked up from the roses I was trimming. "I haven't decided." "Would Ryan inherit it?" "I suppose he could if he wanted it." She nodded thoughtfully. "And the building? What about it? Does the business own it, or do you own it personally?" I stared at her. It was a strangely specific question. She immediately smiled. "Oh, don't look at me like that. I'm just curious." Curious? That word again. I smiled politely. But inside, I felt increasingly uneasy. Over the next month, the questions continued. Not every day. Not even every week. Just often enough to bother me. One afternoon, she asked whether I still had Michael's life insurance payout invested. Another time, she asked whether my mortgage had been paid off years ago. At Christmas, she asked whether property taxes in my neighborhood had increased. At New Year's dinner, she asked whether I had ever considered moving into a retirement community. Each question by itself sounded harmless. Together, they painted a different picture. The strangest part wasn't what Brittany asked. It was how much she already seemed to know. One evening, Ryan and Brittany came over for dinner. After dessert, Brittany mentioned the housing market. She casually estimated the value of my home. Her estimate was almost exactly correct. Within a few $1,000s. I remember staring at her. "How do you know that?" She froze briefly, then smiled. "Oh, I looked at public records online once." The answer sounded reasonable, yet something about it bothered me. Why would she be looking up my property value at all? I couldn't remember ever being curious about someone else's house worth. Not even my closest friends. Later that night, after they left, I sat in my living room thinking about everything. The grandfather clock ticked softly in the corner. Michael had bought that clock 25 years ago. I found myself looking at his photograph on the mantel, sometimes when I missed him most. I spoke to him out loud. That night was one of those nights. "I wish you were here," I whispered. The house felt painfully quiet. Michael had always been better at reading people than I was. He could sense dishonesty long before anyone else. I, unfortunately, preferred believing the best about people. Perhaps that was my weakness. Perhaps that was why Brittany's behavior had taken me so long to notice. The following week brought another uncomfortable moment. I had invited Ryan and his family over for Sophie's 16th birthday celebration. Several relatives attended. The atmosphere was warm and cheerful. At one point, my sister-in-law mentioned that I seemed healthier than ever. Before I could respond, Brittany laughed. "Annette will probably outlive all of us." Everyone chuckled. Then Brittany added something that immediately silenced me. "Still, it's smart to prepare early. You never know when something can happen." The room grew awkwardly quiet. A few relatives exchanged glances. Ryan quickly changed the subject. But I noticed something. Brittany looked disappointed, as though she had hoped the conversation would continue, as though she wanted people discussing my death. The thought unsettled me. A few days later, I received an unexpected phone call. The caller was a woman named Carol. I'd known Carol casually for years through local business circles. She worked in real estate. "Annette," she said warmly, "I hope you don't mind me asking something." "Of course not. I was under the impression your family was preparing to sell your house." My stomach tightened instantly. "What?" There was a pause. "Oh." She suddenly sounded uncomfortable. "Maybe I've misunderstood." "No," I said carefully. "Tell me exactly what happened." Carol hesitated. Then she explained. Several weeks earlier, Brittany had contacted her office. She had asked questions about local property values, specifically my property. She wanted estimates, market projections, expected selling timelines, potential buyer demand. For my house. My house. I gripped the phone so tightly my fingers hurt. "Did she say why?" Carol paused. She implied she was helping with future family planning. Future family planning. The phrase made my skin crawl. When the call ended, I sat motionless at my kitchen table. My coffee had gone cold. Outside, snow drifted gently across the yard. Inside, my thoughts raced. For months, I had tried to explain away every concern, every uncomfortable feeling, every strange question. But this was different. Brittany hadn't simply asked questions anymore. She had taken action behind my back, without my knowledge, without my permission. And she had done it regarding a property that wasn't hers. For the first time, fear mixed with my growing suspicion. Not fear for my safety. Fear that someone I had welcomed into my family might be far more interested in my assets than in me. That realization hurt more than I wanted to admit, because I genuinely loved Brittany once. I had defended her countless times, trusted her, supported her, treated her like a daughter. Now I found myself wondering whether all those years of affection had been real, or whether I had simply been viewed as an eventual inheritance waiting for its turn. And as disturbing as that thought was, an even darker question had started forming in my mind. If Brittany was already researching how to sell my house, what else had she been doing behind my back after my conversation with Carol? I couldn't sleep. For hours, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling above my bed. The house was silent except for the occasional hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside. Normally, I found comfort in those familiar sounds. That night, they only made me feel alone. Carol's words kept repeating in my head. She asked about selling your house. She requested property estimates. She was asking about market timing. The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became, because there was one detail I couldn't ignore. Brittany hadn't come to me first. If she genuinely wanted to help me plan for the future, why not simply ask? Why contact a real estate office behind my back? Why pretend to represent family interests without informing me? None of it made sense. At least, not from the perspective of someone acting honestly. The next morning, I arrived at Schultz Floral before sunrise. Usually, arranging flowers calmed me. The scent of fresh roses and lilies had always brought me peace. But my hands felt distracted. My thoughts kept wandering. Customers came and went. Orders were filled. Phone calls were answered. Yet throughout the day, my mind remained fixed on Brittany. By lunchtime, I had made a decision. I wasn't going to confront her. Not yet. Instead, I wanted facts. I wanted to know whether Carol's call had been an isolated incident or part of something larger. That opportunity arrived sooner than expected. 3 days later, I attended a Chamber of Commerce luncheon downtown. I almost didn't go, but business owners often exchanged useful information at those events. As it turned out, that decision changed everything. Halfway through lunch, I ran into another acquaintance named Greg Lawson. Greg had worked in commercial and residential real estate for more than 20 years. After some small talk, he mentioned something that immediately caught my attention. "How's your daughter-in-law doing?" I forced a smile. "Why do you ask?" He looked surprised. "I spoke with her recently." My pulse quickened. "You did?" "Sure." He nodded casually. "She had questions about property values around your neighborhood." I nearly dropped my coffee. The same thing again. Another real estate professional. Another conversation. Another inquiry about my property. This was no coincidence. I kept my voice calm. "What exactly did she ask?" Greg thought for a moment. "Mostly general market questions." Then he hesitated. There was one thing that seemed unusual. My stomach tightened. "What was that?" He leaned forward. She wanted to know how quickly a house like yours could be sold after a homeowner passes away. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The room suddenly felt warmer. No, not warmer. Smaller. As if the air had disappeared. Greg continued talking, unaware of the storm inside me. I assumed she was helping with family estate planning. I forced a smile. Yes, perhaps. But inside, alarm bells were ringing. This wasn't curiosity anymore. This wasn't concern. This wasn't innocent future planning. Brittany had now spoken to multiple professionals, specifically about my house, specifically about what would happen after my death. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. When I got home that evening, I pulled out an old photo album. Sometimes when life became confusing, I found myself searching through family photographs, looking for reassurance, looking for reminders of happier times. There was Brittany on her wedding day, smiling, beautiful, holding Ryan's hand. There she was again in the hospital after Sophie was born, tears in her eyes, looking genuinely happy. I stared at those pictures for a long time, trying to reconcile them with the woman I was beginning to see. Had she changed, or had I simply failed to notice who she really was? That question haunted me. A week later, another strange incident occurred. I was hosting a small family barbecue at my house. Ryan was grilling burgers. Sophie was helping me prepare lemonade. Brittany was sitting on the patio scrolling through her phone. At one point, I walked inside to grab extra napkins. When I returned, I noticed Brittany standing near my home office. She seemed startled when she saw me. "Everything okay?" I asked. She smiled quickly. "Of course. What were you doing?" "Oh." She laughed. "I was looking for the restroom." The explanation sounded reasonable, except for one problem. The restroom was on the opposite side of the house, and Brittany had visited my home hundreds of times. She knew exactly where it was. I said nothing, but I noticed, and once I started noticing things, I found it difficult to stop. A few days later, Sophie came to visit after school. She often spent time at the flower shop. Unlike many teenagers, she actually enjoyed helping with arrangements. She sat beside me while we assembled bouquets. After a while, she asked a question. "Grandma?" "Yes." "Sweetheart, do you ever want to move?" The question surprised me. "Not really." She nodded slowly. "Good. Why?" She hesitated, then shrugged. "No reason." But her expression suggested otherwise. I studied her face. "Sophie." She looked up. "What's wrong?" For a moment, she seemed uncertain. Then she shook her head. "Nothing." I didn't push, but I made a mental note. Something was bothering her, and somehow, I suspected Brittany might be involved. The following Friday brought another disturbing discovery. I received a letter in the mail. Most people would have thrown it away immediately. At first glance, it looked like ordinary marketing material, a real estate company advertisement, but something caught my eye. My name was handwritten on the envelope. Inside was a note. The agent thanked me for allowing a family representative to discuss future property considerations. A family representative. There it was again. Someone had been presenting themselves as speaking on my behalf. And I knew exactly who. For the first time since all of this began, anger replaced confusion. Not overwhelming anger. Quiet anger. The dangerous kind. The kind that grows slowly. The kind that forms after trust has been broken. I wasn't angry about the property value inquiries. I wasn't even angry about the discussions regarding my future. I was angry because Brittany had never once come to me directly. Instead, she had gone behind my back, repeatedly, systematically. And each new discovery seemed more deliberate than the last. That evening, I sat on my back porch with a cup of tea. The sunset painted the sky shades of orange and purple. Michael used to love evenings like this. I could almost hear his voice. Pay attention to patterns, Annie. He used to say that whenever something didn't feel right. One strange event means nothing. A pattern means something. A pattern. That was exactly what I had now. Not one incident. Not two. A growing list of events that all pointed in the same direction. Brittany wasn't merely curious. She was preparing for something. The question was what? And more importantly, how far was she willing to go as darkness settled over the yard? I made another decision. No more assumptions. No more excuses. No more convincing myself I was imagining things. From this point forward, I was going to pay attention. Very close attention. Because every instinct I had was telling me the truth was much worse than I wanted to believe. And deep down, I had a feeling that Brittany's inquiries about my house were only the beginning. For nearly 2 weeks after receiving the letter from the real estate company, I wrestled with a difficult question. Should I confront Brittany? Part of me wanted to avoid conflict. I had spent my entire life trying to keep peace within my family. The thought of accusing my daughter-in-law of something so serious made me physically uncomfortable. But another part of me knew I couldn't continue pretending nothing was wrong. The evidence kept growing. The questions. The property inquiries. The discussions about my future. The funeral conversation. At some point, silence becomes permission, and I wasn't willing to give permission anymore. So I decided to talk to Brittany directly. Not angrily, not accusingly, just honestly. I invited Ryan and Brittany to my house for dinner on a Thursday evening. I intentionally chose a weekday because Sophie had theater rehearsal and wouldn't be there. I didn't want her caught in the middle. When they arrived, everything seemed normal. Ryan brought a bottle of wine. Brittany brought dessert. We sat down for dinner. For the first half hour, we discussed ordinary things. Work, weather, family updates. Then I set down my fork. My heart pounded. There's something I'd like to ask. Ryan looked up immediately. Sure. Mom. I turned toward Brittany. Why have you been talking to real estate agents about my house? The silence was immediate. Brittany froze. Ryan blinked. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Brittany laughed. A little too quickly. A real estate agent? Several? Actually. Her smile disappeared. What are you talking about? I kept my voice calm. I've spoken with people who said you've asked about my property value. You've asked about selling timelines. You've asked what happens after a homeowner passes away. Ryan's expression shifted from confusion to concern. He looked at Brittany. Britt. She stared at me, Then something remarkable happened. Instead of looking guilty, she looked offended, deeply offended. "Are you seriously accusing me of something?" The reaction caught me off guard. I asked a question. "No, Annette, you're accusing me." Her voice sharpened. "I was trying to help." "Help with what?" She crossed her arms. "Future planning." There was no reason to discuss my house behind my back. Brittany shook her head dramatically. "This is unbelievable." Ryan looked uncomfortable. "Can we all calm down?" I ignored him. "Brittany, if you were helping me, why didn't you simply talk to me?" For a brief moment, she had no answer. Then she recovered. "I didn't think it was a big deal." "A big deal." I couldn't hide my disbelief. "You've discussed selling my home with multiple people." "Because I care about this family." The words came out almost defensively. I studied her face. Something felt wrong. Not just the explanation, the entire performance, the hurt expression, the outrage. It felt rehearsed, as though she had prepared for being questioned. Ryan rubbed his forehead. "Mom, maybe Brittany was just trying to gather information." I turned toward him. "You think that's normal?" He hesitated. "I don't know." "Would you contact real estate agents about someone else's house without asking them?" Ryan didn't answer immediately. That silence gave me hope. Maybe he was finally seeing the situation clearly. Then Brittany spoke again, and everything changed. Tears appeared in her eyes. Almost instantly. "I can't believe this!" Her voice trembled. "I've spent years trying to help this family." Ryan immediately shifted toward her. His entire posture changed. Comforting. Protective. "Britt, it's okay." "No, it's not okay." She wiped away tears. "Your mother thinks I'm some kind of criminal." I felt frustration rising. That wasn't what I'd said. But somehow the conversation was becoming about Brittany's feelings rather than her actions. Ryan put an arm around her shoulders. "Mom, maybe you're reading too much into this." The words hit me harder than I expected. "Maybe you're reading too much into this." For a moment, I simply stared at my son. The boy I had raised. The boy whose scraped knees I bandaged. The boy I sat beside during nightmares. The boy I worked endless hours to support after Michael and I struggled financially in our early years. Now he was looking at me as though I were the unreasonable one. Something inside me cracked. Not dramatically, not visibly, quietly, painfully. "I see." My voice sounded distant even to myself. Ryan frowned. "Mom." "No." I stood from the table. "It's fine." The room felt smaller. Suddenly, I wanted the conversation to end. Immediately. Because I realized I wasn't just confronting Brittany anymore. I was confronting the possibility that my son might not believe me. And that hurt far more than anything Brittany had done. The dinner ended awkwardly. Nobody wanted dessert. Nobody wanted coffee. Within 15 minutes, Ryan and Brittany were leaving. At the front door, Ryan hugged me. The hug felt different, forced, uncertain. "Don't let this get between us." I nodded. But I couldn't bring myself to answer, because something had already come between us. Doubt. As soon as they left, I sat alone in my living room. The house felt unbearably quiet. I stared at Michael's photograph. "You would have handled that better than I did." I laughed sadly. Then I cried. Not because of Brittany, because of Ryan. A parent never fully prepares for the moment their child stops seeing them clearly. I wasn't asking him to choose sides. I wasn't demanding loyalty. I simply wanted him to acknowledge that something felt wrong. Instead, he had chosen the easier explanation, that I was overthinking, that I was imagining things. That age had somehow made me suspicious. The realization hurt more than I cared to admit. The next few days were difficult. Ryan didn't call. Neither did Brittany. For the first time in years, there was tension between us. Even Sunday dinner was canceled. Officially because everyone was busy. Unofficially because nobody wanted another confrontation. The distance bothered me. More than I expected. Then something happened that made everything worse. The following week, I attended Sophie's school theater performance. I arrived early and found a seat near the front, several rows behind me. I noticed Ryan and Brittany. I waved. Ryan smiled. Brittany barely acknowledged me. Throughout the performance, I couldn't stop noticing the coldness, the avoidance, the subtle hostility. Afterward, families gathered in the lobby. Parents hugged their children. Flowers were exchanged. Pictures were taken. I handed Sophie a bouquet. She smiled brightly. "Thanks, Grandma." Then she lowered her voice. "You okay?" The question surprised me. "Why would you ask that?" She hesitated, then glanced toward her parents. "You seemed sad lately." Children notice more than adults realize. I forced a smile. "I'm fine, sweetheart." But Sophie didn't look convinced. Before I could say anything else, Brittany called her over. The moment passed, yet the exchange stayed with me, because Sophie had noticed something. The tension, the distance, the sadness. And if a 16-year-old could see it, then things were worse than I had wanted to believe. That night, lying in bed, I thought about everything that had happened. My confrontation with Brittany, Ryan defending her, the growing distance between us. For the first time, I considered the possibility that this situation might become much bigger than I had imagined. Because if Brittany truly had hidden motives, then she wasn't acting alone anymore, whether intentionally or not. Ryan was protecting her, trusting her, believing her, and that made the situation far more dangerous. As I stared into the darkness, another troubling thought entered my mind. If Brittany had successfully convinced Ryan that I was overreacting, what else had she convinced him of, and how much did my own son really know about what his wife had been doing behind my back? The week after my confrontation with Brittany was one of the loneliest weeks I had experienced since Michael died. Ryan barely called. Brittany didn't call at all. Even family group messages became noticeably quieter. Everything felt strained, artificial, as though everyone was pretending nothing had happened while carefully avoiding the subject that had caused the tension. I threw myself into work. Flowers had always been my refuge. When life became difficult, I arranged roses, amezies. When my heart felt heavy, I worked with lilies. When grief became overwhelming, I buried myself in wedding orders and sympathy arrangements. But even Schultz Floral couldn't completely distract me this time. Every time the front door opened, part of me hoped Ryan would walk in. He didn't. Every time my phone rang, I wondered if it might be him. Usually it wasn't. Then, on a rainy Wednesday afternoon, Sophie appeared. She wasn't supposed to be there. School had just ended. Normally, Brittany picked her up and drove her home. Yet there she was, standing in the doorway of my shop with a backpack slung over one shoulder. "Grandma," I smiled immediately. "Well, this is a nice surprise." She smiled back, though something about her expression seemed nervous. "I walked over." "You walked?" She nodded. "It's not that far." I knew she wasn't telling me the whole truth, but I also knew Sophie well enough not to push immediately. "Come help me with these roses." Her shoulders relaxed slightly. For the next hour, we worked side by side, just like we had done dozens of times before. We trimmed stems, wrapped bouquets, organized ribbon. Slowly, the tension in her face began to fade. Eventually, I handed her a cup of hot chocolate from the small coffee machine in the back office. She sat across from me at a tiny wooden table. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then she surprised me. "Grandma, are you mad at Mom?" The question caught me off guard. I carefully set down my cup. "Why would you ask that?" She stared at the table. "Because things have been weird." I sighed softly. "Sometimes adults disagree." She nodded. "I know." There was another silence. Then she looked up. "You don't trust her anymore, do you?" Children really do see more than adults realize. I considered my answer carefully. "I think I'm trying to understand some things." Sophie looked relieved, as though she had expected me to deny it. Instead, she lowered her voice. "Can I tell you something?" Immediately, my attention sharpened. "Of course." She hesitated. The nervousness returned. "I don't want anyone to know I told you." A knot formed in my stomach. "Okay." She looked toward the shop entrance to make sure nobody was nearby. Then she leaned forward. A chill ran through me before she even spoke. "I heard Mom talking on the phone." My heartbeat quickened. "When?" "A few months ago." I remained silent, letting her continue. "It was late." She swallowed. "I was upstairs." Her fingers tightened around her mug. "I wasn't trying to listen." "I know." "But I heard your name." Every instinct in my body told me to stay calm. Inside. However, my pulse was racing. "What did she say?" Sophie stared into her hot chocolate. For several seconds, she didn't answer. Then she spoke quietly. "I heard her say your house would belong to us someday." The room suddenly felt colder. I said nothing. Sophie continued. "She said we just had to be patient." My chest tightened. Those words sounded far too familiar, far too deliberate, far too specific. "Are you sure?" She nodded immediately. "Yes." What exactly did she say? Sophie closed her eyes briefly, trying to remember. Then she repeated the words as accurately as she could. That house is worth a fortune. Eventually it'll be ours anyway. We just have to be patient. The sentence landed like a weight on my chest. I looked away for a moment. Not because I doubted Sophie, because I believed her. Completely. The sincerity in her eyes left no room for doubt. She wasn't exaggerating. She wasn't trying to create drama. If anything, she seemed uncomfortable sharing it. What else did she say? Sophie hesitated again. Then she looked genuinely guilty. I didn't tell you before because I thought maybe I misunderstood. You don't have to apologize. But there's more. My stomach sank. Of course there was. I also heard her talking about money. I felt my pulse quicken again. What kind of money? I don't know exactly. Sophie frowned. But she said something about finally being able to breathe financially. The words hung in the air. Financially. Another piece of the puzzle. Another clue. Another reason for concern. I forced myself to remain calm. Did your dad hear any of this? She shook her head. No. Did you tell him? No. Why not? Sophie looked down. The answer broke my heart. Because I didn't want my parents to fight. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I reached across the table and gently squeezed her hand. She was 16 years old. She shouldn't have been carrying this burden. She shouldn't have felt responsible for protecting everyone else's feelings. Yet here she was, trying to keep peace between people she loved. I recognized the behavior immediately. Because it was exactly what I had done most of my life. Sweetheart, I said softly, none of this is your fault. Tears appeared in her eyes. I know. But she didn't sound convinced. After a few moments, she continued. There was one other thing. I braced myself. Okay. She looked nervous again. Mom was talking to Aunt Melissa. Melissa was Brittany's sister. What did she say? Sophie swallowed. She said that eventually everything would work out because you had no one else to leave things to. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. The sentence hit harder than anything else. Not because of the money. Not because of the inheritance. Because of the casual assumption behind it. As though I were already gone. As though my life were simply a waiting period before assets changed ownership. As though I were a collection of properties and accounts rather than a living person. I felt suddenly exhausted. Deeply exhausted. Not physically. Emotionally. Sophie reached across the table. Grandma. I forced a smile. I'm okay. But the truth was, I wasn't. Not entirely. Because for the first time, I could no longer pretend these incidents were isolated. The pattern had become undeniable. The real estate inquiries, the funeral discussion, the property questions, the inheritance comments. Now Sophie's story. Each piece pointed toward the same disturbing conclusion. Brittany wasn't merely curious. She wasn't simply planning ahead. She was thinking about my assets long before my death should have been anyone's concern. And somehow, that realization hurt even more coming from the mouth of my granddaughter. Because Sophie had no agenda, no motive, no reason to lie, only concern. As the rain continued tapping softly against the shop windows, I looked at the teenager sitting across from me, and for the first time in weeks, I realized something important. I wasn't completely alone. Someone else had noticed. Someone else had heard things. Someone else felt that something wasn't right. The realization brought both comfort and sadness. Comfort because I wasn't imagining it. Sadness because a 16-year-old girl had been forced to see the side of her own mother. When Sophie finally left that afternoon, I stood alone in the shop long after closing time. The lights were off. The flowers sat quietly in their coolers, and I found myself thinking about a question I had been avoiding. If Brittany was already talking about inheriting my house, then how much did she actually know about my finances? And more importantly, what had she already done to find out after my conversation with Sophie? I spent 3 sleepless nights staring at the ceiling. Not because I doubted what she had told me, because I believed every word. That was the problem. If Sophie had sounded uncertain, I could have dismissed it. If she had seemed dramatic, I could have explained it away. But she hadn't. She had looked frightened, guilty, heartbroken, and most importantly, honest. The image of my granddaughter sitting across from me in the flower shop wouldn't leave my mind. Neither would the words she claimed Brittany had spoken. Eventually it'll be ours anyway. The sentence echoed endlessly. By the 4th morning, I finally accepted something I had been resisting. I needed professional advice, not from a friend, not from family, from someone who knew exactly how inheritance laws worked, someone who had known Michael and me for years, someone I trusted completely. Thomas Bennett. Thomas wasn't just our attorney. He had been part of our lives for more than 25 years. He had helped Michael and me purchase the flower shop property. He had prepared our wills. He had handled estate matters after Michael passed away. Most importantly, he was one of the few people who never sugarcoated the truth. If something was wrong, Thomas would tell me. I called his office that morning. "Annette," his assistant said warmly. "It's been a while." "It has. Thomas can see you Thursday afternoon." Perfect. When Thursday arrived, I drove downtown feeling strangely nervous. Not because I expected bad news, because I feared my suspicions might be confirmed. The law office looked exactly the same as it always had. Dark wood furniture, leather chairs, family photographs on Thomas's desk. The familiar surroundings offered some comfort. When Thomas entered the conference room, he smiled immediately. "Annette Schultz." He opened his arms. "It's good to see you." I stood and hugged him. "You too." Then his expression changed. The smile faded slightly. "You sound worried on the phone." I sat down slowly. "Because I am." For the next 20 minutes, I told him everything. The funeral conversation, the property inquiries, the real estate agents, the documents Brittany had been asking about, Sophie's story. Thomas listened carefully without interrupting. Occasionally, he made notes. Occasionally, he frowned. When I finally finished, the room fell silent. He leaned back in his chair. "What do you think?" I asked. Thomas didn't answer immediately. That alone concerned me. Finally, he folded his hands. "I think your instincts deserve attention." A knot tightened in my stomach. "Meaning, I don't think you're imagining things." I stared at him. Those words carried enormous weight. Because unlike my son, Thomas wasn't emotionally involved. He had no reason to take sides. He was simply evaluating facts, and the facts clearly bothered him. He opened a folder on his desk. "There's something I should mention." Immediately, my pulse quickened. "What?" Thomas adjusted his glasses. A few months ago, Brittany contacted my office." For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. "What?" He nodded. I didn't think much of it at the time. My heart started pounding. What exactly did she want? Thomas opened a file. I documented the conversation. The fact that he had documented it made me even more nervous. He scanned several notes, then began reading. She asked general questions about estate planning. I frowned. General. At first. The phrase caught my attention. At first? Thomas nodded. Then her questions became more specific. A chill traveled down my spine. How specific? He looked directly at me. She asked how property transfers after a death. I closed my eyes briefly. Of course she had. Thomas continued. She asked whether beneficiaries automatically gain access to assets. My hands tightened around the armrests. She also asked about probate timelines. I stared at him. The room felt suddenly smaller. Anything else? Thomas hesitated. That hesitation frightened me. Thomas, he sighed. She wanted to know whether adult children can challenge certain trust structures. The words landed heavily. Trust structures. That wasn't casual curiosity. That wasn't ordinary family planning. Those were specific legal questions. Questions someone asks when actively thinking about inheritance. My inheritance. Thomas closed the folder. At the time, I assumed she was helping family members understand future planning. What did you tell her? I told her very little. Relief washed through me. Because his expression hardened. Because she wasn't my client. For the first time that afternoon, I smiled. Thomas had always been protective, especially after Michael died. I appreciate that. He nodded, then leaned forward. Annette, there's something important you need to understand. The seriousness in his voice immediately got my attention. What? The questions Brittany asked weren't random. My stomach sank. I know. No? He shook his head. You don't. The room grew silent. Thomas chose his words carefully. Those questions followed a logical sequence. I felt a chill. What does that mean? It means someone was gathering information. I stared at him. The sentence felt much heavier than it sounded. Gathering information for what? Thomas sighed. Potential asset transfer. There it was, the possibility I had been avoiding, spoken aloud. Not by me, not by Sophie, by an attorney with decades of experience. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked the question that had been haunting me. Do you think she's planning something? Thomas thought carefully before answering. I think she's very interested in your finances. That's not the same thing. No. He nodded. It isn't. I waited. And Thomas leaned back. I think you should be cautious. The answer was measured. professional, yet somehow more alarming than if he had simply agreed with me. Because Thomas wasn't prone to exaggeration. If caution was his recommendation, there was probably a reason. Then something unexpected happened. He opened another file, a much older file. My name was written across the front. "Let's review your current estate documents." I blinked. Now. Over the next hour, we reviewed everything. My will, business ownership, property records, investment accounts, insurance policies. As we worked, I began feeling slightly better. Everything appeared secure. Everything appeared organized. Nothing seemed compromised. Then Thomas paused. His eyes narrowed slightly. "What?" He tapped a page. "When was the last time you discussed these documents with Ryan or Brittany?" "Years ago." He nodded slowly. "Good." The answer confused me. "Why?" Thomas looked thoughtful. "Because some of Brittany's questions suggest she believes she understands your estate structure." A chill ran through me. But her questions indicate she doesn't actually know everything. For the first time that day, genuine curiosity replaced fear. "What do you mean?" Thomas smiled faintly. "A person asking those questions is missing some important information." "What information?" He closed the folder. "I'd rather not discuss that yet." I stared at him. "Thomas." He shook his head. "Not yet." The small smile remained. And suddenly, for the first time in weeks, I sensed something different. Not fear, not concern, confidence. As though Thomas knew something Brittany didn't. As though there were pieces of this puzzle still hidden. Pieces that might eventually matter. When our meeting finally ended, he walked me to the door. Before I left, he placed a hand gently on my shoulder. "Annette, yes. Pay attention." My stomach tightened. "To what?" "Everything." Then he added quietly, "Because I have a feeling Brittany isn't finished." As I walked toward my car, those words echoed in my mind. I wasn't finished either, because now I knew something important. Brittany hadn't merely been gossiping. She had been actively researching inheritance, actively gathering information, actively trying to understand what would happen after my death. And for the first time, I couldn't help wondering exactly how far she was willing to go to get the answers she wanted. After my meeting with Thomas Bennett, I couldn't stop thinking about one particular statement. A person asking those questions is missing some important information. He had refused to tell me exactly what he meant. At first, that frustrated me. Then I realized Thomas rarely withheld information without a reason. He wasn't trying to be mysterious. He was trying to be careful. Still, his words stayed with me. Important information. What information? What didn't Brittany know? And why did Thomas seem almost confident that she didn't have the full picture? The more I thought about it, the more I understood something else. For months, I had been reacting to conversations, reacting to discoveries, reacting to Brittany's behavior. I was constantly one step behind. That needed to change. If I wanted answers, I needed to stop reacting and start observing. Carefully, deliberately. That's when an idea formed. Not a trap exactly. A test. A simple test. One piece of information. One statement. And then I would watch. If Brittany truly cared about me, her reaction would be normal. If her interest centered around my money, her reaction would reveal it. The following Sunday, I invited everyone to dinner. Ryan, Brittany, Sophie. The atmosphere was still slightly awkward after our recent disagreements. Ryan was making an obvious effort to act cheerful. Brittany was polite but distant. Sophie seemed relieved that everyone was in the same room without arguing. Dinner proceeded quietly. We ate roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans. For most of the evening, conversation remained harmless. School, work, local news. Exactly what I expected. Then, halfway through dessert, I made my move. I set down my fork. I met with Thomas Bennett recently. Ryan nodded. Everything okay? Perfectly fine, I smiled. I was reviewing some estate planning. Immediately, I noticed something. Brittany looked up. Not dramatically, not obviously, but enough. Her attention sharpened. I continued casually. Actually, I've been thinking about doing something important. Nobody spoke. I took a sip of coffee, then delivered the line I had rehearsed. I'm considering donating most of my estate. The room froze. Not entirely. Just enough. Ryan blinked. Donating, I nodded. To charity. Silence. Then I continued. I've been thinking about creating a children's scholarship fund in Michael's name. I watched Brittany carefully. Years of arranging flowers had taught me something unexpected. People reveal themselves through tiny expressions, tiny reactions, tiny pauses. And in that moment, I saw one for less than a second. Shock. Not sadness. Not surprise. Shock. Then it disappeared. Her smile returned, but it was forced, artificial. Ryan looked thoughtful. That's generous. I think your father would have liked it. Ryan smiled softly. He probably would. Then everyone turned toward Brittany, waiting. Her response came a little too late. A scholarship sounds wonderful. Wonderful. Yet her voice lacked enthusiasm. The difference was subtle, but I heard it. So did Sophie. I could tell by the way she glanced at her mother. The conversation moved on, at least outwardly. Inside, I was paying attention to every detail. And over the next several weeks, the results became impossible to ignore. Before that dinner, Brittany had called frequently. She checked on me, asked whether I needed help, invited me to events, stopped by the flower shop occasionally. After that dinner, things changed. Not overnight, but noticeably. The phone calls became less frequent. The invitations became less enthusiastic. The concern became less visible. At first, I wondered if I was imagining it. Then even Ryan noticed. One afternoon, he called. Mom, everything okay between you and Brittany? I almost laughed. What makes you ask? I don't know. He hesitated. She seems distant lately. Interesting. Very interesting. I kept my voice neutral. I'm sure she's just busy. But after we hung up, I sat in my office smiling to myself. Because Ryan had noticed it too. The difference wasn't only visible to me. A week later, the evidence became even harder to ignore. I hosted another family dinner. During the meal, I casually mentioned that I had met with representatives from a children's hospital foundation. The statement wasn't entirely false. I had spoken with them years earlier. But Brittany didn't know that. The reaction was immediate. Her smile vanished. Not completely. Just enough. Then she quickly changed the subject. That alone told me plenty. The old Brittany would have asked questions. What kind of foundation? What kind of scholarship? What inspired the idea? Instead, she wanted the conversation over as quickly as possible. The pattern continued. The more I talked about charitable giving, the less interested Brittany became in discussions about my future. And for the first time, I felt something close to certainty. Because concern for an elderly family member doesn't disappear when money disappears. Only self-interest does. Then something happened that confirmed my suspicions more strongly than anything else. I arrived early at Ryan's house one Saturday afternoon, much earlier than expected. I had promised Sophie a ride to a community theater workshop. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed Brittany's car was there. The front door was slightly open. As I approached, voices drifted outside. Brittany was speaking. I recognized her voice immediately. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. But then I heard my name, and instinctively, I stopped. Everything has changed. There was frustration in her tone. I couldn't hear the other person. Probably someone on speakerphone. Then Brittany continued. If she gives it away, there won't be much left. My heart began pounding. The voice on the phone responded. I couldn't make out the words. Brittany sighed loudly. No, I don't know if she's serious. Another pause. Then came a sentence that sent a chill through me. She never talked about charity before. Silence followed. Then she lowered her voice. Unfortunately for her, I was standing close enough to hear. We've waited all these years. We, not I. We. The word echoed in my mind. Who exactly was we, Brittany, and whom? The person on the phone. Someone else. Before I could hear more, footsteps approached. I quickly moved away from the door. Seconds later, Brittany stepped outside. The moment she saw me, she jumped slightly. Annette! I smiled politely. Brittany. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. Then she forced a smile. You're early. I know. Something about her expression looked nervous, almost guilty, but only for a moment. Then her usual composure returned. The rest of the afternoon passed normally. At least on the surface. Inside. However, my thoughts raced. Because I had just learned something important. The possibility of losing access to my assets upset Brittany far more than the possibility of losing me. That realization hurt. Even though I had expected it. Even though I had suspected it. Actually hearing it was different. That evening, after dropping Sophie home, I sat alone in my living room. The house felt unusually quiet. I thought about Michael, about trust, about family, about how difficult it can be to accept uncomfortable truths. Then I remembered something Thomas had said. Pay attention. I was, and what I was seeing wasn't good, because my little test had worked. Far better than I expected. Brittany had revealed herself. Not completely. Not yet. But enough. Enough for me to know I was on the right path. Enough for me to understand that her interest in my future was directly connected to my money. And enough for me to realize something even more troubling. If the possibility of losing an inheritance upset her this much, what might she do next to protect the future she thought she deserved? After my little experiment, I expected Brittany to become more careful. Instead, she became more aggressive. At first, the change was subtle. Then it became impossible to ignore. It started with phone calls. Before, Brittany would occasionally mention estate planning in passing. Now, she brought it up almost every time we spoke. One Monday afternoon, she called while I was arranging flowers for a wedding. Hi, Annette. Hello, Brittany. After less than 2 minutes of small talk, she moved directly to the subject. I was thinking about something. Of course you were. I thought, what is it? Have you finalized your end-of-life plans? I nearly laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was becoming predictable. What specifically? You know, her tone sounded overly casual. Funeral wishes? Medical directives? Legal paperwork? I set down my pruning shears. Why are you suddenly so interested in this? There was a pause. Then came the familiar answer. I'm just trying to help. I ended the conversation politely. But after hanging up, I wrote down the date, the question, the exact wording. For some reason, I had started keeping notes. Maybe it was because Thomas had taught me the value of documentation. Maybe it was because my instincts were telling me something important. Either way, I recorded everything, and over the next several weeks, my notebook filled surprisingly quickly. Another call, another question, another discussion about my future. Then came the paperwork. That was when things truly escalated. One Saturday afternoon, Brittany arrived at my house unexpectedly. She carried a leather folder. The moment I saw it, I felt uneasy. What's that? She smiled brightly. Just some documents. I should have known. We sat at the kitchen table. Brittany opened the folder carefully. Several neatly organized forms sat inside. At first glance, they looked official. Very official. Too official. I've been doing some research. I leaned back. Dangerous words. What kind of research? Planning documents. She slid several papers toward me. These would make things much easier for everyone. I glanced down. Power of attorney forms. Medical authorization documents. Financial management paperwork. Immediately, alarm bells began ringing in my head. I kept my expression neutral. Where did these come from? Online. She smiled. A lot of families use them. I flipped through the pages. Some were partially completed. My name appeared repeatedly. Certain sections had already been filled in. That disturbed me more than anything, because someone had clearly spent time preparing them, and that someone wasn't me. What exactly are you asking me to sign? Brittany laughed lightly. Oh, nothing urgent. Nothing urgent. Yet she had arrived unannounced carrying legal paperwork. Interesting. I continued reading. The deeper I looked, the more uncomfortable I became. Most of the language appeared routine, reasonable, practical. Exactly the kind of documents many older adults eventually create. But something felt off. I couldn't explain it. I simply knew I wasn't signing anything without Thomas reviewing it first. I'll think about it. The smile vanished briefly, only for a second, then it returned. Of course. Yet I could hear the disappointment, the frustration, the expectation that I would sign immediately. When she left, I placed the folder inside a desk drawer. Then I called Thomas. Immediately. His assistant scheduled me for the following morning. The moment I entered his office, I handed him the folder. Please tell me whether I'm imagining things. Thomas adjusted his glasses, then began reading. For the first several minutes, he said nothing. Absolutely nothing. The silence itself made me nervous. Finally, he looked up. His expression had changed, and not in a good way. Who prepared these? Brittany. His jaw tightened slightly. Did she explain them? Not really. He nodded slowly, then continued reading. Another long silence followed. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded noticeably firmer. Do not sign anything. My stomach dropped. Why? Thomas slid one document toward me. Read this paragraph. I did. Twice. Then a third time. My blood ran cold. The language was complicated. Legal. Easy to overlook. But the meaning became clear once Thomas explained it. This document could allow someone to manage portions of your financial affairs. I stared at him. What? He nodded. Under certain circumstances. I felt my pulse accelerate. What circumstances? Depending on interpretation, circumstances that could be argued more broadly than most people realize. The room suddenly felt much warmer. Thomas pulled out another document, then another. Each time he pointed to specific sections, specific clauses, specific wording, and each explanation made me more uncomfortable. By the end of the meeting, I felt physically sick. Not because the documents were necessarily fraudulent, because they were clever, very clever. Most people would never notice the implications. Most people would trust the person presenting them, especially if that person was family. Thomas folded his hands. Annette. I looked up. I need you to listen carefully. The seriousness in his voice immediately got my attention. Okay. These documents create potential access. My throat tightened. Access to what? Influence. The word hung in the air. Not ownership. Not theft. Influence. Control. Authority. Power. The exact things Brittany seemed increasingly interested in. I stared at the papers, trying to process everything. Then another question entered my mind. One that hadn't occurred to me before. How would she even know about these forms? Thomas hesitated, then shrugged. Research. Maybe. But I wasn't entirely convinced, because Brittany wasn't an attorney. She wasn't a financial planner. She wasn't involved in estate administration. Yet somehow, she had assembled a sophisticated collection of documents designed to create influence over an elderly person's affairs. That didn't feel accidental. Before I left, Thomas handed the folder back to me. "Keep these." "Why?" "Documentation." The word immediately reminded me of my notebook. My growing collection of observations. My growing collection of concerns. Thomas was doing the same thing. And that realization frightened me. Because Thomas wasn't easily alarmed. If he believed documentation mattered, there was a reason. The biggest shock came 3 days later. Ryan called unexpectedly. His voice sounded uneasy. "Mom." "Hi, sweetheart. I have a question." My stomach tightened. "What is it?" There was a pause. Then, "Did Brittany bring some paperwork to your house recently?" I sat upright immediately. "Why?" Another pause. Longer this time. Then Ryan sighed. "Because I signed some documents a while ago." The room became completely silent. I felt my pulse quicken. "What documents?" "I'm not sure." Every instinct in my body activated simultaneously. "What do you mean you're not sure?" Ryan sounded embarrassed. "Britt said they were routine." I closed my eyes. "Routine? Of course." "Did you read them?" The silence answered before he did. "No." A cold feeling settled in my chest. Not because Ryan had done something malicious. Because Ryan trusted his wife. The way spouses are supposed to. And now I suddenly understood how dangerous that trust could become. "What exactly did you sign?" "I don't know." His voice sounded weaker now. Concerned. Confused. For the first time, I heard uncertainty. Real uncertainty. Not defense. Not denial. Doubt. And that doubt changed everything. Because if Ryan had signed documents without understanding them, then Brittany's actions extended far beyond me. Far beyond inheritance discussions. Far beyond funeral planning. She was actively collecting signatures, actively gathering paperwork, actively building something. I just didn't know what yet. After hanging up, I sat alone in my living room for nearly an hour. The folder rested on the coffee table beside me. The same folder Brittany had smiled while presenting. The same folder Thomas had warned me about. The same folder that now seemed connected to documents Ryan himself didn't fully understand. For the first time since this entire nightmare began, genuine fear replaced suspicion. Not fear that Brittany wanted my money. I already knew that. Fear that her plans were much larger than I had originally imagined. And deep down, I had a growing feeling that the most dangerous secrets still hadn't been uncovered. After my conversation with Ryan, I couldn't stop thinking about one sentence. "I signed some documents a while ago." The words echoed in my mind for days. Not because Ryan had signed something malicious, because Ryan was careful by nature. Methodical. Responsible. The kind of man who read appliance manuals before using new equipment. The kind of man who compared insurance policies line by line. If even Ryan had signed paperwork without fully understanding it, Brittany must have been extremely convincing, or extremely determined. Possibly both. The next morning, I called Thomas Bennett. When he heard what Ryan had told me, he immediately asked me to come in. His urgency alone made my stomach tighten. An hour later, I sat across from him once again. The folder Brittany had given me rested on the desk between us. Thomas looked unusually serious. I spoke too soon. My pulse quickened. What do you mean? I originally thought Brittany was simply gathering information. The pause that followed felt endless. But Thomas folded his hands. Now I'm beginning to think she was building a framework. The phrase sent a chill down my spine. A framework for what? He opened the folder again, then carefully laid several documents side by side. Control. The word landed heavily. Not inheritance, not ownership. Control. He pointed toward one document. This form creates authority under certain conditions. Then another. This one supports financial decision-making authority. Then another. This one strengthens administrative access. I stared at the papers. Separately, they seemed harmless. Together, they painted a different picture. A much different picture. Thomas continued. Most people wouldn't notice this. Notice what? The sequence. I swallowed. What sequence? He leaned back. The documents aren't random. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then he explained. One form supported another. One authorization strengthened another. One signature increased the effectiveness of the next. Individually, they appeared routine. Collectively, they created influence, significant influence. The realization made me feel sick. Not because Brittany had succeeded, because she had clearly planned something. Something that required preparation. Something that required paperwork. Something that required access. And she had been working toward it for longer than I realized. Then Thomas revealed something that shocked me even more. Look here. He handed me another document. I immediately recognized Ryan's signature. My chest tightened. That's his. Thomas nodded. I know. I studied the page carefully. The signature looked authentic, natural, not forged. Ryan had genuinely signed it. What does it do? Thomas explained. By itself, very little. Combined with other documents, potentially much more. I felt a wave of anger rising inside me. Not explosive anger, protective anger. Because Ryan wasn't being malicious. He was being trusting. And someone he loved appeared to be using that trust. For several minutes, I simply stared at the papers. Then a question occurred to me. Can she actually do anything with these? Thomas considered his answer carefully. Not yet. The relief was immediate, but short-lived. Yet, he nodded. Not yet. I hated those words, because they implied possibility, potential, future danger. Thomas continued. The problem isn't what she currently has. What is the problem? The problem is what she appears to be trying to collect. I looked down at the documents again, and suddenly, everything felt different. The funeral planning, the inheritance questions, the real estate inquiries, the pressure, the signatures, the legal forms. Individually, they had seemed suspicious. Together, they resembled a strategy, a long-term strategy. And for the first time, I began wondering just how long Brittany had been planning all this. When I left Thomas's office that afternoon, I felt emotionally exhausted. The sky outside was gray. Rain threatened in the distance. I drove directly to the flower shop. Normally, work helped clear my mind. Not today. Today, my thoughts raced endlessly. Around 3 o'clock, my phone rang. Ryan. I answered immediately. Hi. Sweetheart. His voice sounded tense. Mom. Can we talk? Of course. There was a long silence. Then he spoke. I asked Brittany about the paperwork. I sat down instantly. What happened? Another silence. Longer this time. She got defensive. Not surprising. What did she say? She said you're turning me against her. I closed my eyes. Of course she did. The familiar strategy. Deflection. Victimhood. Emotional manipulation. The pattern was becoming increasingly recognizable. Ryan sighed heavily. Mom. Something in his voice had changed. Something important. What is it? I don't know what to believe anymore. The admission caught me off guard, because it was the first honest thing he'd said about the situation, the first crack in the wall Brittany had built around him. I kept my voice gentle. You don't have to decide today. I know. But things aren't adding up. No, they weren't. And finally, Ryan was beginning to see it. I asked her why she wanted those documents. What did she say? She said she was protecting the family. The answer sounded familiar. Too familiar. Because it was the same justification she'd used with me. The same explanation. Repeated endlessly. Protecting the family. Helping the family. Planning for the future. Yet somehow, every road seemed to lead back to my assets. My property. My estate. My death. Ryan continued. Then I asked why she didn't tell me everything. My heart skipped. And his voice grew quieter. She couldn't answer. The room fell silent. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Ryan said something that surprised me. I think I've been ignoring things. Emotion tightened my throat. Not because I felt vindicated, because I heard pain in his voice. Real pain. The kind that comes when trust begins to crack. A mother never wants her child to suffer, even when that suffering leads to the truth. Ryan. Yeah. Whatever happens. I love you. Silence. Then, I love you too, Mom. After we hung up, I sat motionless for several minutes. A major shift had just occurred. For months, Ryan had defended Brittany, explained away concerns, dismissed suspicions. Now doubt had entered his mind, and doubt changes everything. Later that evening, another unexpected development occurred. Sophie called. Her voice sounded nervous. Grandma. Hi. Sweetheart. I think Mom and Dad are fighting. My heart sank. What happened? I don't know exactly. She hesitated. But they've been arguing about money. Money. The word immediately caught my attention. What kind of money? I couldn't hear everything. She sounded uncomfortable. But Dad kept asking questions. Questions. Good. Questions meant investigation. Questions meant Ryan was no longer accepting simple explanations. Before ending the call, Sophie said something that stayed with me. I've never seen Dad look at Mom like that before. I knew exactly what she meant. Trust doesn't disappear all at once. It erodes, slowly, painfully. One question at a time. One inconsistency at a time. One uncomfortable truth at a time. That night, I sat on my back porch long after sunset. The air felt cool. The neighborhood was quiet. For weeks, I had felt like I was fighting alone. Not anymore. Now Ryan was beginning to see what I had seen. Not everything. Not yet. But enough. Enough to start asking questions. Enough to start paying attention. Enough to start noticing contradictions. And deep down, I had a feeling those questions were about to uncover something much larger than suspicious paperwork. Because people don't spend months building systems of control without a reason. And sooner or later, that reason always reveals itself. The only question was how much damage it would cause when it finally did. The conversation with Ryan stayed with me for days, not because it solved anything, because it changed something fundamental. For the first time since this ordeal began, my son was asking questions instead of defending answers. The shift was subtle, fragile, but it was real, and Brittany knew it. I could feel it. People who rely on control rarely panic when everyone agrees with them. They panic when people start thinking for themselves. The following week, Ryan called again. This time, he sounded exhausted. Not angry, not defensive, simply tired. "Mom, are you busy?" I was arranging hydrangeas for a wedding order. "I can talk." There was a long silence. Then he sighed. "I don't know who my wife is right now." The pain in his voice immediately broke my heart. No matter what Brittany had done, Ryan was still my son. And watching his marriage unravel wasn't something I enjoyed. Not even a little. "What happened?" He hesitated, then spoke quietly. I started looking through our finances. My stomach tightened. There it was. The beginning. "What did you find?" Another silence. Longer this time. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded strained. "Things don't make sense." I sat down. "What kind of things?" Ryan exhaled slowly. "Credit cards." The word hung in the air. "Credit cards. Several." My pulse quickened. "We have balances I didn't know about." I closed my eyes briefly. The puzzle pieces were starting to move. "How much?" Ryan didn't answer immediately. When he finally did, his voice was barely above a whisper. "More than $60,000. I nearly dropped the phone. 60,000. Not hundreds. Not thousands. Tens of thousands. The number stunned me. "Ryan." "I know." His voice cracked slightly. "I know." For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then he continued. "That's not all." Of course it wasn't. It never is. "What else?" "Personal loans." I felt my stomach sink further. How many? 3. The room suddenly felt too small. Ryan sounded devastated. As far as I can tell, she's been moving dead around for years. Years. Not months. Not recently. Years. That realization changed everything, because it meant Brittany's obsession with my assets might not be new at all. It might have been building for a very long time. The next 40 minutes were some of the hardest of my life. Ryan carefully explained everything he had discovered. Hidden balances, refinanced debt, consolidation loans, missed disclosures, financial obligations he knew little or nothing about. The deeper he dug, the worse things became. And through it all, one question remained unanswered. Why? What had happened to all the money? At first, Ryan assumed there must be an explanation. Medical bills, unexpected expenses, household emergencies. But the numbers didn't support those theories. Not even close. The spending patterns pointed elsewhere, toward lifestyle spending, shopping, luxury purchases, vacations, online transactions, and investments. Failed investments. That detail immediately caught my attention. Investments. Ryan sighed. Apparently, my heart sank. Because failed investments create desperation, and desperate people make dangerous decisions. The next evening, Ryan came to my house, alone. That hadn't happened in months. When he walked through the door, I barely recognized him. His shoulders looked heavier. His eyes looked older. He sat at my kitchen table exactly where Brittany had once placed those documents in front of me. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then Ryan pulled out a folder, a thick folder, far thicker than the one Brittany had brought. Slowly, he opened it. Credit card statements, loan records, account summaries, pages and pages of financial documents. The evidence was overwhelming. I studied them carefully, not because I doubted him, because I wanted to understand. Some of the debt stretched back nearly 7 years. Others were more recent. A few accounts had been opened without meaningful discussion. Several investments had lost substantial amounts of money. And throughout it all, Ryan remained disturbingly uninformed. How did you not know? The question escaped before I could stop it. Ryan looked ashamed. I trusted her. The answer hurt, because it was so simple, so human, so understandable. People trust their spouses. They're supposed to. That trust wasn't a flaw. The betrayal was. Ryan stared at the paperwork. I feel stupid. You're not stupid. I should have known. No. I shook my head. You should have been able to trust your wife. For a moment, emotion crossed his face. Then he looked away. That was when I realized something. Ryan wasn't only grieving financial deception. He was grieving the marriage he thought he had. And that kind of loss cuts deep, very deep. Over the following week, his investigation continued. The more he uncovered, the worse things became. Several accounts were linked to investment schemes that had failed years earlier. Thousands of dollars had vanished. Then tens of thousands. then more. Every discovery revealed another layer, another secret, another omission. Meanwhile, Brittany became increasingly defensive. According to Ryan, every conversation ended the same way. Arguments, tears, accusations, deflection. Whenever he asked direct questions, she changed the subject. Whenever he requested explanations, she became emotional. Whenever he presented evidence, she claimed he was attacking her. The pattern sounded familiar because she had used the same strategy with me. Only now it wasn't working. Not like before, because facts have a stubborn way of surviving emotional manipulation. Then came the discovery that truly shocked Ryan. 3 days later, he called me after midnight. His voice sounded hollow, almost numb. "Mom." I sat up immediately. "What happened?" For several seconds, he couldn't answer. Then, I found messages. The words sent a chill through me. What kind of messages? Between Brittany and her sister, Melissa, the same sister Sophie had mentioned months earlier. My heart began pounding. "What did they say?" Ryan laughed bitterly. Not because anything was funny, because reality sometimes becomes unbearable. Then he read part of a conversation aloud. One message, then another, then another. With every sentence, my stomach tightened. The messages discussed debt, financial pressure, missed payments, fear, desperation. And then came the sentence that made everything clear. Once Annette's estate eventually comes through, everything will stabilize. The room went silent. Neither of us spoke, because there was nothing left to say. There it was. The motive, not the entire story, but the heart of it. For years, Brittany had viewed my future inheritance as a solution to her financial problems, not a possibility, a plan, a future rescue, a financial lifeline. And when I threatened that assumption by discussing charitable donations, she panicked. Everything suddenly made sense. The funeral planning, the inheritance questions, the property research, the legal documents, the pressure. All of it. Every single piece. Ryan finally broke the silence. "I don't know how to come back from this." I didn't have an answer. Because some wounds don't heal overnight. Some betrayals permanently change relationships. And this one felt enormous. After we ended the call, I sat alone in darkness. The house was quiet. Michael's photograph rested on the mantel nearby. For months, I had wondered whether I was imagining things, whether I was being unfair, whether age had made me suspicious. Now I knew the truth. I hadn't been imagining anything. The reality was actually worse. Much worse. Because Brittany hadn't simply become obsessed with inheritance. She had built years of financial expectations around it. And now those expectations were collapsing. As I stared into the darkness, another realization settled over me. We finally understood why Brittany wanted my assets. But a troubling question still remained. Exactly how much debt was she hiding? And was Ryan truly seeing the whole picture yet? My instincts told me the answer was no. And unfortunately, My instincts had been right far too often lately. The truth finally began unraveling faster than any of us expected. For months, Brittany had controlled the pace. She controlled the conversations. She controlled the narrative. She controlled what Ryan knew, what he didn't know, what questions were asked, and what questions were avoided. But once Ryan started digging, everything changed. Because secrets are like cracks in a dam. One crack becomes two. Two become 10. Eventually, the entire structure collapses. That's exactly what happened. 3 days after Ryan discovered the messages between Brittany and her sister Melissa, he asked Brittany for complete access to every financial account they shared. Every account. Every statement. Every loan. Every investment. No exceptions, hell. According to Ryan, the argument lasted nearly 4 hours. Brittany cried. She yelled. She accused him of betraying her. She accused me of poisoning him against her. She accused everyone except herself. But eventually she handed over the information. And what Ryan found shocked even Thomas Bennett. The following Monday, Ryan and I sat in Thomas's office together. Stacks of documents covered the conference table. Bank statements, loan records, credit reports, investment summaries. The evidence looked overwhelming because it was. Thomas spent nearly 2 hours reviewing everything. When he finally leaned back in his chair, his expression was grim. "How bad is it?" Ryan asked. Thomas looked directly at him. "Worse than you think." The room went silent. Ryan swallowed. "What does that mean?" Thomas tapped several folders. "The debt isn't 60,000. Ryan froze. Neither of us spoke. Thomas continued. "It's significantly higher." My stomach tightened. "How much?" The answer took several seconds. Then, approximately $230,000. For a moment, nobody moved, nobody breathed, nobody spoke. $230,000. The number sounded impossible, absurd. Ryan stared at Thomas. "No." His voice cracked. "That's impossible." "I wish it were." Thomas slid several documents forward. The numbers didn't lie. Loan balances, interest obligations, personal credit lines, investment losses. Everything combined into a financial disaster. Ryan looked physically ill. His face turned pale. His hands trembled. I reached across the table and gently squeezed his arm. He didn't react. He was staring at the paperwork, trying to understand how his life had become something he no longer recognized. Then Thomas revealed another bombshell. "There's more." Of course there was. There always was. "What now?" Ryan asked quietly. Thomas opened another file. Several loans were obtained using projected inheritance disclosures. The room fell silent. I frowned. "What does that mean?" Thomas looked directly at me. "It means Brittany represented future inheritance as a future financial resource." My blood ran cold. "What?" He nodded. "Not directly as collateral." Ryan closed his eyes. "But indirectly." The realization hit all of us simultaneously. Brittany hadn't simply expected my inheritance, she had planned around it. borrowed against the assumption of it, built financial decisions around money that wasn't hers, money she had never been promised, money belonging to a living person. Me. Suddenly, every bizarre conversation made sense. Every inheritance question, every funeral discussion, every property inquiry, every legal document, every piece fit together. Because Brittany wasn't merely being greedy, she was desperate. And desperation had transformed into obsession. Ryan looked devastated. "I don't understand," Thomas sighed. "I think she convinced herself the inheritance was inevitable." The explanation made terrible sense. Terrible, heartbreaking sense. When people believe something long enough, they stop treating it as a possibility. They begin treating it as certainty. Apparently, Brittany had done exactly that. The following week became one of the hardest weeks our family had ever experienced. Ryan confronted Brittany with everything: the debt, the messages, the loans, the hidden accounts, the inheritance assumptions, everything. At first, she denied portions of it. Then, she minimized it. Then she blamed circumstances. Then she blamed stress. Eventually, however, the truth emerged, and it was uglier than anyone expected. According to Ryan, the problems had started nearly 8 years earlier, not long after Michael died. A friend convinced Brittany to invest in a business opportunity. The investment failed. She lost thousands. Determined to recover the loss, she invested again, then again, then again. Each failure created another attempt, another risk, another loan, another secret. Over time, the losses snowballed. Small debts became larger debts. Larger debts became major debts. And somewhere along the way, Brittany convinced herself that everything would eventually be fixed. How? Through my estate, through my property, through my death. The realization horrified me. Not because she wanted money, because she had spent years mentally spending assets that weren't hers. Years imagining a future built on my absence. Years treating my eventual death as a financial solution. That was what hurt most. Not the money, the mindset. A few days later, something unexpected happened. Brittany asked to see me, alone. At first, I refused. I wasn't ready. I wasn't angry. I was exhausted, emotionally exhausted. But after discussing it with Ryan and Thomas, I agreed. The meeting took place at my flower shop after closing hours. The moment Brittany walked through the door, I barely recognized her. She looked different, smaller somehow. Not physically, emotionally. The confidence was gone. The certainty was gone. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then she started crying. Not dramatic tears, not theatrical tears, real tears. At least they appeared real. "I'm sorry." The words came immediately, without explanation, without defense, just apology. I stood quietly, Waiting. She wiped her eyes. I don't even know where to start. I remained silent. Eventually, she sat down. Then the story poured out. The failed investments, the mounting debt, the panic, the fear, the shame. For nearly an hour, she talked. And for the first time, I saw something I hadn't seen before. Not greed, fear, deep fear, years of fear. Fear hidden beneath control. Fear hidden beneath manipulation. Fear hidden beneath entitlement. The problem was that fear didn't excuse what she'd done. Not even close. When she finished speaking, the shop became silent. Finally, I asked one question, the only question that truly mattered. When did you stop seeing me as a person? The words hit her like a physical blow. She immediately began crying again. But I continued. When did I become an estate plan? She covered her face. When did I become property values and inheritance projections instead of your family? The silence stretched between us. Painful, heavy, unavoidable. Finally, she whispered, I don't know. And for the first time, I believed her. Because somewhere along the way, Brittany had lost sight of something essential. She had become so focused on solving financial problems that she stopped seeing people clearly, stopped seeing consequences clearly, stopped seeing me clearly. When she left that evening, I stood alone among thousands of flowers. The shop felt strangely peaceful, not because things were fixed. They weren't, not even close, but because the truth was finally in the open. No more guessing, no more suspicions, no more hidden motives. Now we knew, and sometimes the truth, no matter how painful, is easier to face than uncertainty. Yet as I locked the shop and prepared to go home, one reality remained. The truth had been exposed. The damage had not, and repairing that damage would require something far more difficult than uncovering secrets. It would require deciding whether our family could ever trust Brittany again. The family meeting took place on a Saturday afternoon. By then, everyone knew the truth was unavoidable. There would be no more delays, no more excuses, no more carefully crafted explanations. For months, secrets had lived in the shadows. Now they were about to be dragged into the light. Ryan asked everyone to meet at my house. Not because it was convenient, because it mattered. This house had been the center of our family for decades. Birthdays, Christmas mornings, graduation celebrations, holiday dinners. Every major family memory seemed connected to these walls. And now, unfortunately, one of the worst moments would be too. I spent the morning cleaning even though the house was already spotless. It was nervous energy, the kind people feel before surgery, before funerals, before life-changing conversations. By noon, my stomach was in knots. At 1 o'clock, Thomas Bennett arrived. He carried a briefcase. Inside were copies of financial records, legal documents, and evidence Ryan had collected. An hour later, Ryan arrived with Sophie. Brittany came separately. That fact alone said a lot. When she entered the house, nobody hugged her, nobody smiled, nobody spoke. The atmosphere felt heavy, uncomfortable, final. We gathered around the dining room table. the same table where countless family meals had taken place. Now it looked more like a courtroom. Ryan sat beside Sophie. Thomas sat near me. Brittany sat alone across from everyone. For several moments, silence filled the room. Then Ryan spoke first. His voice sounded calm. Too calm. The kind of calm people use when they're fighting to keep their emotions under control. We need the truth. Nobody responded. Ryan looked directly at Brittany. No more excuses. Brittany stared down at the table. We already talked about this. No. Ryan shook his head. We talked around it. Silence. Then he placed a folder in front of her. The folder containing everything: debt records, messages, loans, financial statements, evidence. Years of evidence. Brittany immediately looked away. That was the first sign. People avoid looking at things they don't want to confront. Ryan noticed too. You need to answer some questions. Her shoulders tensed. What questions? Ryan's voice remained steady. When did this start? For several seconds, she said nothing. Then, I don't know. It wasn't enough. Everyone knew it. Ryan knew it too. You do know. Another silence. Finally, Brittany whispered. About 8 years ago. The answer landed heavily. 8 years. Right around the time Michael died. Right around the time I was rebuilding my life. Right around the time Brittany's financial problems began. Ryan nodded slowly. As soon as the investment losses started, she looked shocked. The expression revealed everything. Because she hadn't expected him to know. How did you? I know about all of them. Her face drained of color. The room fell silent. For the first time, Brittany seemed genuinely frightened. Not because she had been accused, because she realized there was nowhere left to hide. Ryan continued. Every investment. Another pause. Every loan. Silence. Every account. Still silence. And every message. At those words, Brittany closed her eyes. The fight was disappearing from her. Everyone could see it. The defenses were collapsing. Slowly. Painfully. I looked toward Sophie. My granddaughter sat perfectly still. She looked heartbroken. Not angry, heartbroken. Watching a parent fall from a pedestal is one of the most painful experiences a child can endure. I hated that she was witnessing this. But there was no avoiding it anymore. Ryan leaned forward, then asked the question everyone wanted answered. Why? Simple, direct, devastating. Why? Why the lies? Why the secrecy? Why the obsession with inheritance? Why the funeral plans? Why all of it for nearly a minute? Brittany didn't answer. The silence stretched painfully. Then, finally, she spoke. At first, her voice was barely audible. I was scared. Nobody responded. She continued. The investments failed. Tears formed in her eyes. I thought I could fix it. Ryan stared at her. By hiding it. She nodded weakly. The room remained silent. Then Brittany looked toward me. For the first time all afternoon, she met my eyes. What I saw there wasn't arrogance. It wasn't manipulation. It wasn't entitlement. It was shame. Raw shame. I never meant for it to go this far. The words might have sounded convincing months earlier. Now they simply sounded tragic, because intentions no longer mattered. Consequences did. Ryan's voice hardened. When did my mother's inheritance become part of your plan? That question changed everything, because it forced Brittany to confront the truth directly. No more talking around it. No more euphemisms. Inheritance. My inheritance. The thing nobody had wanted to say aloud. For a long time. Brittany said nothing. Then she whispered, after the second investment failed. Ryan stared at her. I stared at her. Even Thomas looked stunned, because that answer revealed something horrifying. The inheritance hadn't become important recently. It had become important years ago. Years. An entire future had been built around assumptions regarding my death. Brittany wiped tears from her face. Then came the confession. The moment everything finally shattered. I thought it was inevitable. The room went completely silent. I thought someday Ryan would inherit everything. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. She continued. I kept telling myself we just needed to survive until then. The words sounded even worse aloud, because she genuinely believed them, not as a possibility, as a financial strategy, a life plan, a rescue plan, and perhaps, most disturbing of all, a certainty. Ryan looked physically sick. When you talked about my mother's funeral, his voice cracked. Brittany immediately started crying harder, but Ryan didn't stop. When you researched her house, no response. When you pressured her to sign documents, still no response. When you asked attorneys about inheritance, the silence became unbearable. Finally, Ryan asked the question that broke everyone. Were you waiting for my mother to die? The room froze. Even the air felt still. Sophie began crying immediately. I felt tears forming in my own eyes, because none of us wanted to hear the answer. Not really. Brittany covered her face, then shook her head violently. No, her voice broke. No. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then she lowered her hands. The tears continued falling. I wasn't waiting for her to die. The room remained silent. Then she whispered the words that revealed everything. I just stopped thinking about how horrible that sounded. No one responded, because there was nothing left to say. That statement explained everything. The debt, the obsession, the entitlement, the planning, the funeral discussions, the property research, the legal documents, everything. She had become so focused on solving financial problems that she stopped seeing reality clearly, stopped seeing morality clearly, stopped seeing people clearly, including me. Ryan leaned back in his chair. His eyes looked empty, exhausted, broken. Finally, he spoke, and his words cut deeper than any accusation. I don't recognize you anymore. The room fell silent again. Brittany cried openly. Sophie looked away. I closed my eyes briefly, because in that moment, I realized something painful. This wasn't a fight anymore. This wasn't an argument. This was the collapse of an illusion. The collapse of the family Brittany had pretended to have. The collapse of the future she had built inside her mind. And perhaps most devastating of all, the collapse of Ryan's trust. As the silence settled over the room, I knew the confrontation wasn't truly over. One final truth still remained hidden. One final revelation that Brittany knew nothing about. And when that truth emerged, everything she had spent years planning would disappear in an instant. The silence after Brittany's confession felt endless. No one knew what to say. No one knew what could be said. Years of lies had finally been exposed. Years of assumptions. Years of financial fantasies built around a future that never belonged to her. And yet, despite everything that had happened, one final truth still remained hidden. A truth only two people in that room knew. Thomas Bennett and me. As everyone sat quietly around the dining room table, Thomas looked toward me. Our eyes met briefly. He understood. The moment had arrived. For months, Brittany had obsessed over an inheritance she believed would someday solve her problems. For years, she had treated my estate as a future certainty. The irony was almost unbearable, because the entire foundation of her plan was based on something she didn't understand, something she had never bothered to ask, something she simply assumed. I slowly stood from my chair. Every eye turned toward me. Ryan looked exhausted. Sophie looked emotionally drained. Brittany looked defeated. For a moment, I simply stared at the family I loved. Then I spoke. There is something all of you need to know. The room became still. Even Brittany looked up. Thomas remained silent, waiting. I took a deep breath. Several years ago, after Michael died, I made some decisions about my estate. Immediately, Brittany's expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough. Attention, hope, fear, all mixed together. I continued. Those decisions were never a secret. Ryan frowned. What decisions? I smiled sadly. The decisions Brittany spent years trying to figure out. Nobody spoke. Then I looked toward Thomas. He nodded. A silent signal. Permission. I continued. The reason Brittany never found the answers she wanted. I paused. Is because she was looking in the wrong places. Confusion appeared on several faces, including Brittany's. What does that mean? Ryan asked. I sat back down slowly, then spoke the words that changed everything. The flower shop doesn't belong to me anymore. The room froze. Complete silence. Brittany stared. Ryan blinked. Even Sophie looked confused. What? Ryan spoke first. I nodded. Not legally. Nobody understood. Not yet. I continued carefully. 5 years ago, I transferred ownership of Schultz Floral into a protected charitable trust. For several seconds, nobody reacted. Because nobody fully understood. Then Thomas spoke, his voice calm and professional. The trust was established in Michael Schultz's memory. Brittany looked stunned. Thomas continued. It funds educational grants, community gardening programs, and scholarships for young entrepreneurs. The color drained from Brittany's face. I watched the realization begin. Slowly, painfully. Like a sunrise she wished she could stop. Ryan looked shocked. Mom? You've been doing this for 5 years. I smiled softly. Yes. Why didn't you tell us? Because I wasn't seeking recognition. The room remained silent. Then I delivered the second revelation, the one Brittany truly wasn't prepared for. And my home. Nobody moved. Nobody blinked. My home isn't part of Ryan's inheritance either. This time, Brittany physically recoiled, only slightly, but everyone saw it. Thomas opened his briefcase, then removed several documents. Annette's residence is part of a life estate structure. The legal language confused Ryan immediately. What does that mean? Thomas explained. Annette owns and controls the home for the remainder of her life. Ryan nodded. Okay. After her death, the property will be sold. The room remained silent. Then Thomas finished. The proceeds will fund the Michael and Annette Schultz Scholarship Foundation. The words landed like thunder. No one spoke. No one moved. No one breathed. Because suddenly, the entire story transformed. Every assumption Brittany had built her life around, every expectation, every projection, every calculation, gone. Years of planning, gone. Years of entitlement, gone. Years of waiting, gone. The inheritance she imagined had never existed. Not in the way she believed. Not for years. I watched Brittany carefully. At first, she looked confused, then shocked, then devastated, then something else, something unexpected. Humiliation. Because for the first time, she understood the full truth. She had spent years obsessing over assets that were never truly available. Years sacrificing relationships for a financial fantasy. Years damaging her marriage. Damaging her family. Not with hatred, just honesty. I never wanted to become a financial plan. Tears filled her eyes immediately. I know. No. I shook my head gently. I don't think you did. The statement wasn't cruel. It was truthful. Because if she had understood, none of this would have happened. She stared at the table, unable to meet my eyes. Then something unexpected occurred. For the first time since this nightmare began, Brittany stopped defending herself. Completely. No excuses. No explanations. No blame. No justifications. Only silence. And sometimes, silence reveals more than words ever could. Several minutes passed. Then Sophie quietly spoke. Her voice trembled. Mom. Everyone turned toward her. Tears streamed down her cheeks. I don't care about money. The sentence shattered whatever emotional defenses remained. Brittany immediately began sobbing. Real sobbing. The kind that comes from complete collapse. Not manipulation. Not performance. Collapse. Sophie continued. I just wanted us to be a family. No one spoke, because everyone felt the truth in those words. The entire tragedy suddenly became crystal clear. This was never really about money. Money was simply the tool. The deeper issue was fear. Fear of failure. Fear of financial ruin. Fear of losing status. Fear of consequences. Fear had slowly poisoned everything until Brittany stopped seeing people, stopped seeing relationships, stopped seeing family. All she could see was survival, and survival without morality eventually becomes destruction. Ryan finally stood, slowly, quietly. He looked toward Brittany, then toward Sophie, then toward me. The pain in his eyes was impossible to miss. We need time. Nobody argued. Nobody objected, because everyone understood. Some wounds require time. Some betrayals require distance. Some truths require space to process. As the meeting finally ended, people slowly gathered their belongings. Nobody rushed. Nobody knew exactly what came next. Outside, evening sunlight filtered through the trees. The world looked strangely peaceful, almost normal. Yet nothing about our family was normal anymore. Everything had changed. The lies were gone. The secrets were gone. The illusion was gone. Now only truth remained, and truth, while painful, offers something lies never can, a chance to rebuild. Whether that rebuilding would actually happen remained uncertain. But for the first time in a very long time, at least we were standing on solid ground. And sometimes that's where healing finally begins. The weeks following the family meeting were some of the quietest weeks of my life. Not peaceful, not at first, just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm tears through a town. The wind is gone. The rain has stopped. But everywhere you look, there is damage waiting to be repaired. That was where our family found itself. The truth was finally out. No more secrets. No more assumptions. No more pretending. Now we had to decide what came next. For Ryan, that decision was the hardest. Over the following month, he and Brittany separated. Not officially at first, just physically. Brittany moved into a small apartment across town while they tried to figure out what remained of their marriage. I never celebrated that decision. Some people expected me to. After everything Brittany had done, they assumed I would feel victorious. I didn't. There was no victory in watching a family break apart. There was only sadness. Sadness for Ryan. Sadness for Sophie. Even sadness for Brittany. Because regardless of her choices, she had become trapped by her own fear long before anyone else understood what was happening. Fear had destroyed her judgment. Fear had destroyed her integrity. And eventually, fear had destroyed the life she was trying so desperately to protect. One afternoon, about 6 weeks after the meeting, Ryan came to visit. The autumn leaves had started changing colors. Gold, orange, crimson. Michael had always loved this time of year. Ryan sat with me on the back porch where his father and I had spent countless evenings. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then he finally broke the silence. "I'm sorry." The words came quietly, honestly. Not because someone told him to say them, because he needed to. I looked at my son, really looked at him. The exhaustion was still there, but something else had returned. Clarity. "I know." He shook his head. "No." His voice cracked slightly. "You warned me." I remained silent. "You tried to tell me." Tears appeared in his eyes. "And I didn't listen." My heart broke for him, not because he had made mistakes, because he was carrying guilt he didn't deserve. "Ryan." He looked up. "You trusted your wife." The tears finally escaped. "I should have trusted you too." I reached over and squeezed his hand. "You don't have to choose between loving your wife and loving your mother." The statement seemed to surprise him, because it was true. This had never been a competition. I never wanted Ryan to choose sides. I only wanted him to see clearly, and now he did. Months later, Sophie began spending more time at the flower shop again. At first, she came because she needed a break from everything happening at home. Then she stayed because she genuinely enjoyed it. Working beside her became one of the greatest gifts of my life. We arranged flowers together, delivered bouquets together, shared lunches together, talked for hours, for years. I had worried about what inheritance I might leave behind. Money, property, assets. Now I understood something different. The most valuable thing I would ever leave behind wasn't sitting in a bank account. It was time, memories, values, love. One afternoon, while helping me prepare centerpieces for a wedding, Sophie asked a question. "Grandma." "Yes." "If all this never happened, would you have changed anything?" I smiled, then thought carefully. Finally, I answered honestly, "Yes." She looked surprised. "What? I would have had more conversations?" "About money." I shook my head. No. She waited. "About values." The distinction mattered, because money wasn't what destroyed our family. Fear did. Silence did. Avoidance did. The money was simply where those problems appeared. As winter approached, Schultz Floral continued thriving. Business remained strong. The scholarship foundation expanded. More students received assistance. More community programs were funded. Every time I saw a young entrepreneur receive support through Michael's foundation, I thought about him, and I smiled, because this was exactly what he would have wanted. A legacy that helped people, not one that divided them. About 9 months after the family meeting, Brittany asked if she could see me. The request surprised everyone, especially Ryan. By then, she had begun working with financial counselors, therapists, debt specialists. She had sold personal assets, taken responsibility for repayment plans. For the first time in years, she was confronting reality instead of running from it. I agreed to meet her. Not because everything was forgiven, because healing requires honesty. We met at a small coffee shop. When she arrived, she looked different. Not older, lighter. The desperation was gone. The constant tension was gone. For several minutes, we simply talked. Not about inheritance, not about money, not about blame, just life. Eventually, she looked at me. I don't expect forgiveness. I appreciated the honesty, because true accountability doesn't demand forgiveness. It accepts consequences. Then she said something I'll never forget. I spent years worrying about what would happen after you died. She shook her head sadly. And I completely forgot to appreciate that you were alive. The words hit me harder than anything else she had said, because that was the tragedy. Not the money, not the debt, not the legal documents. The tragedy was wasted years. Years that should have been spent building relationships instead of calculating inheritances. Years that should have been filled with gratitude instead of expectation. When we left that coffee shop, I didn't know what the future held for Brittany. I didn't know whether her marriage would survive. I didn't know whether trust could ever fully return. Some wounds leave permanent scars. That's simply reality. But I did know one thing. She finally understood. And sometimes understanding is where redemption begins. Today, as I tell this story, I am sitting in the office of Schultz Floral, the same flower shop Michael and I built decades ago. The same flower shop that carried me through grief, through loss, through betrayal, through healing. Outside my window, customers come and go. Life continues, as it always does. Ryan visits often. Sophie still helps at the shop. The Scholarship Foundation continues growing. And me, I'm still here, still healthy, still working, still driving myself to work every morning, still making my own decisions. And yes, I've completed my funeral plans. Not because someone pressured me, not because someone was waiting for an inheritance, because they're my plans, my choices, my life. The greatest lesson I learned through all of this is surprisingly simple. Money reveals character. It doesn't create it. And the most valuable inheritance we leave behind is never wealth. It's the way we treat people while we're still here. Because one day, every house will be sold, every account will be closed, every possession will belong to someone else. But kindness, integrity, respect, love, those things outlive us all. And that is the legacy I hope to leave behind. If my story taught me anything, it is this: never let anyone make you feel like your life is already over while you are still breathing, thinking, loving, and choosing for yourself. Aging does not mean surrendering your voice. Being a mother or grandmother does not mean becoming someone else's financial plan. Love should never come with a hidden calculation behind it. Family should protect dignity, not exploit trust. And forgiveness, when it comes, should never require pretending the damage did not happen. If this story moved you, please share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in my place? Have you ever had to protect your peace from someone close to you? Please like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I'd love to hear your story too.